The reason you don't want to go with your gut, the reason you don't want to trust your intuitions is that they're not adapted for the modern world. That's not what they're adapted for. They're adapted for the savannah. That's what the research on the mind shows us very clearly, very concisely. That's what they're adapted for. When we were hunters and gatherers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, that's what our gut intuitions are adapted for. So think about that. What does that mean for us? Well, our main threat response is the fight or flight response. That's how we feel. That's what our gut intuition, that's how it responds to threats.
Hey everybody, I'm Ken Newhouse, and I'm going to welcome you to the Get Clients Now podcast, the show where high-growth consultants and professionals come to access the newest and most effective methods and systems for online marketing, advanced sales and persuasive communication strategies, and automated marketing funnels. And if you're wondering if the Get Clients Now podcast can help you get more high-value clients, enjoy more sales, build a massive tribe, and make more money, you're absolutely going to love this show.
Newhouse's work completely blows everything else that we've ever done with Google out of the water.
I have been looking for a way to grow my presence online, and what I've viewed from Newhouse's work was something that certainly is faster than anything I've seen before.
He says he's going to do something and he does it. He does it in the time frame that he says he's going to do it in. It's exciting when you talk about the results that you're going to get, and you can believe his word because he follows it up with action.
The Newhouse is direct, he's to the point, he tells you what's on his mind, and he backs his words up. From what I know now, from working with him, he's passionate about his work, and he backs it up 100%.
What I like best is you offer something that no one else has out there, which is a pretty comprehensive approach about marketing, a system.
If somebody asks me, should they use Newhouse's team? Absolutely, because you're going to get the important information that you need very, very quickly.
On the internet, on the different marketing techniques, I've never experienced anything like this.
I would definitely recommend Ken Newhouse for someone who's serious about growing their business. I think that your results based on the numbers would at least double the sales in a very short time frame.
Hey everybody, Ken Newhouse here from kennewhouse.com, and I'm going to welcome you back to the Get Clients Now podcast, where the one-size-fits-all marketing model is dumb, the client-centric business model is king, and leading experts share strategies and methods that you can use to accelerate brand acceptance, skyrocket your significance in the marketplace, and elevate your status, allowing you to build your tribe with certainty. Today's episode number 353 of the Get Clients Now podcast, and today our guest is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, that's with a T. Dr. Tsipursky is a PhD. He is a regular contributor for Inc. magazine, Time, Scientific American, Fast Company, and Entrepreneur. But that's not why I have him on the show today. I have him on the show today because of the decision-making process he's created. It's a framework. It is a step-by-step process you can use to make accurate decisions that are going to serve you best, especially during this coronavirus pandemic, especially during this time of emotional uncertainty, of financial uncertainty, of great unrest and instability. I think it's fair to say that more than any time in my lifetime, probably in your lifetime as well, there's more uncertainty, there's more angst, there is more consternation in the marketplace in the entire population, not only the United States, but of the entire world. I've interviewed people over the last, probably the last 12 months. I think I've interviewed at least 24 guests that are high-level persuasion and communication experts. Every single one of them has told me that emotion plays a critical part in the decision-making process. But in times like this, in times where your cortisol levels, where your adrenaline levels are at an all-time high, emotions can get the better of you and can literally hijack the decision-making process. And as a result, you can end up making disastrous decisions that can literally destroy your company, that can destroy your future. It's bad enough that we have to deal with all the nonsense that we're dealing with right now. But when you add on top of that all the extra stress that you're dealing with, it's very, very easy to end up making a really bad decision, a decision that can not only cost you lots and lots of money, but it can cost you your company. It can cost you your future. And so I thought it was really important to have Dr. Tsipursky on the call today, not just because Dr. Tsipursky is one of the world's leading experts on the decision-making process, but because Dr. Tsipursky is the world's leading authority on how to make decisions without being overtaken by your emotions. And so having said that, I've already done the interview with Dr. Tsipursky, and so let's do this. Let's go ahead and run through his bio, and then I want to dive into the interview as quickly as possible. Dr. Tsipursky is known as the disaster avoidance expert and internationally recognized thought leader on this particular topic. Dr. Tsipursky is on a mission to protect leaders and business owners from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases by developing the most effective decision-making framework possible. He has over 2 decades of consulting, coaching, and training experience as CEO of disaster avoidance experts, and over 15 years of experience in academia as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist. As I mentioned before, Dr. Tsipursky is a regular contributor for Inc. magazine, Time, Scientific American, Fast Company, and Entrepreneur. He's also a best-selling author, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about his newest book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Tsipursky in on the show. Hey everybody, Ken Newhouse here with you today, and I've got my special guest, Gleb Tsipursky. Gleb is the author of, let me go with this right, okay. That's what I thought it was. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Never Go With Your Gut. It's a great book. Actually, I would say it's slightly technical, but it's not too technical. But certainly the content is relevant, Gleb, especially in light of all the decisions we're having to make now with COVID-19, the crisis that we're all dealing with. Certainly, I found your book very apropos, very relevant in these times. And so I'm excited about the interview today. So on behalf of myself and the members of the Get Clients Now Nation, I want to go ahead and welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much, Ken. I appreciate being here, and it's definitely an important time to avoid going with your gut. Too many people are going with their gut right now, and they're making terrible decisions that will lead them into disastrous situations.
You know, that's easy to do, especially, given the crisis. In fact, I've never seen anything like this in my life. I lived through, 9/11, I had multiple, at that time I was in private practice as a chiropractor. I had multiple practices, tons of employees working for me. My situation is completely different now. I'm a solopreneur. I outsource everything, got burnt out on having employees, but still with my clients, even some of our members who've reached out to me, they're in a very emotional state right now, and they're not very well grounded, a lot of them. And so they're making decisions. And sometimes I think they're making, especially as it relates to their business, they're making bad decisions, which makes things obviously worse. So we're going to dig into that and give them a lot of help today with the content. But first, if we could, these are the first 2 questions I mentioned to you earlier. These are 2 questions that I ask all the guests on the show. If you could take about 2 to 3 minutes, Gleb, and give us a little bit of your backstory from how you got to, where you are now from where you started, so that it makes sense for us on the show today. Because I'm sure a lot of people, I didn't really know you. I'd heard of your book, I've heard of your work, but I didn't really know you like I do now. But give us a little backstory so we can kind of start from that point on the show today and move forward and make this really work for us.
Happy to. Well, my backstory with my expertise in disaster avoidance, risk management, decision-making actually starts in my childhood. Now, my parents, like pretty much everybody else, felt that going with their gut is the right thing to do, thought that this was the right approach, trusting their gut, following their intuitions, being primal, as Tony Robbins would say, blinking, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, all of that stuff. Unfortunately, their guts often disagreed with each other. So, for example, my mom, she liked to buy nice clothing, so she'd go out and she'd buy a $100 sweater. My dad was kind of a cheapskate, so she'd come home and he'd yell at her, saying, no sweater should be worth over $20. And then they'd go at it, blaming each other for one thing, blaming each other for the other things, and that it would escalate into a major confrontation. And I, as a little kid, was watching that, and I was already judging that was not a good thing, because neither of them was changing their behavior. As a result, they just had more conflicts, more fights. And as I grew up, I was born in 81. I came of age around the dot-com boom, when tech leaders were partying like it's 1999 and 1999 when I was 18. But just a couple of years later, when I was 21, 2001, 2002, there was the dot-com bust. So all the tech leaders who were the heroes in the Wall Street Journal in 1999 were now the zeros in 2001, 2002. And that was not maliciously bad decision-making, just unconsciously bad decision-making. Even worse, of course, were the WorldCom, the Enrons, the Bernie Ebbers of the world, who maliciously hid their losses from the dot-com bust using fraudulent accounting methods, leading to a great deal of damage, harm, and suffering for people who invested in those companies, and discrediting capitalism, big companies a lot in that time. That was pretty terrible. So that helped me realize that, nobody taught me how to make good decisions, especially financial decisions. Nobody sat me down and say, hey kiddo, here's how you make good decisions. I wasn't taught that by my parents, not by high school, not by college, not taught that in business school, of course. So I decided to study this topic. And as I started studying it, other people started asking me about it. I started doing presentations about it. So I became a trainer, consultant, coach, speaker on these topics. And I've been doing that for 20 years. And of course, there is unfortunately very little quality information on decision making and risk management out there in the popular literature. So I went into academia, into cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics. So studying how our brain works, that's the cognitive neuroscience, and how we behave in economic situations, that's the behavioral economics. So I've studied that for 15 years and published a bunch of peer-reviewed papers. I taught as a professor for 7 years at Ohio State University, so go Bucks. That's where I'm right now in Columbus, Ohio. And I brought all of that together in my latest book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And of course, unfortunately, my work is very much in demand right now with COVID-19. I have a bunch of clients who I'm worked with them to prepare disaster preparedness plans who are calling me right now and with whom I'm working to address the current situation. So it's unfortunate, but sometimes my work is really needed, especially in the middle of a crisis. So that's where I am, and that's what brought me to this place.
So guys, let me just say this, and I failed to refer to Gleb as doctor, and I'm a doctor, and so I just figured we would just go with first names, but
that's totally
make no
fine.
mistakes. Yeah, Gleb is certainly a qualified professional. He has earned a PhD, and so he's not just some run-of-the-mill person. This is a super qualified expert, not only with the fact that he's got the PhD, but you've got a tremendous track record. You've got some very well-known clients. You've got a lot of big clients, big corporate clients, but you also work with small business owners as well. Gleb, has there been any, this is the second question that I like to ask. Has there been an individual or a circumstance? You kind of gave us a little bit of a circumstance when you just kind of did the introduction, but an individual circumstance, maybe even a book that really triggered this in your mind where you said, hey, listen, this is what I want to pursue. This is really my passion, that kind of led you to the point where you are right now. Was there any one moment in time, whether it's a book, person, or an incident that you can think of?
Yes, so the work of Danny Kahneman, he is one of the forefathers, probably the forefather of the work on decision-making and cognitive biases, which are the specific decision-making mistakes we tend to make because of how our brain is wired. He's part of that first generation which researched how our brain is actually messed up and why we make these mistakes. And so discovering his work was fundamentally important for me in realizing that, hey, the kind of stuff I was studying in popular literature and decision-making is kind of crappy. I really need to go into academia to study the quality stuff. Unfortunately, he published a book called Thinking Fast and Slow in 2011, which is available for a broad audience. Now, it's a pretty long and dense book. It's about 400-ish pages. But if you want to check out his work in a way that's available for a broad audience, not in individual journal articles that are paywalled behind $30 paywalls for each journal article, that's a good place to start. So Thinking Fast and Slow, Danny Kahneman, that's a great book. Me and other people who are cognitive neuroscientists who are part of the second generation have studied not the specific cognitive biases, the dangerous judgment errors, but debiasing, the practice of defeating these cognitive biases in order to make the right decision. So that's my research, but I'm standing on his shoulders, so I really appreciate his work and want to give him some props.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's one of the things I think that really interested me the most was the debiasing, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But Daniel Kahneman is number one, he's a psychologist, correct? But isn't he
That's
also,
right.
He's the first psychologist, in fact, to ever win a Nobel Prize.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
yep,
absolutely. So I mean, he's a kind of a quirky individual, but yeah, that's a good book. But certainly, I think as far as having the rubber meet the road and getting practical application for an individual's business, while his book was really, really good, obviously sold millions of copies, I do think your book is actually a better investment for people for the simple fact that you're giving how-to instructions. You provide a framework in the book that they can just plug and play and run with it. Very, very helpful. So anyway, one of the things, we talk about people we're in the middle of COVID-19, Gleb, and people are making a lot of emotional decisions, but let's kind of stop for just a minute and go back a couple of months before all this nonsense really got started. The process, or one of the favorite processes that people like to use in business, is SWOT analysis, and I really appreciate how you outlined all the difficulties and all the potential errors and pitfalls that can occur as a result of using SWOT analysis. So if you could take a couple minutes and talk about how people use that process, that framework, and why it is it's got so many weak points in it, if you will, that can lead to really disastrous decision making.
Yeah, folks use the SWOT analysis to address strategic planning and the weakness of human thinking. And unfortunately, they often use it, whenever I've seen it used very badly because of the inherent dangers of the cognitive biases that aren't addressed by the SWOT analysis. Now, the SWOT analysis, for folks who aren't familiar with it, has a group of business owners, leaders, professionals, so leadership team, or an entrepreneur, solopreneur, small business owner, look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats facing their business. When they go through it, unfortunately, business leaders, business owners tend to fall into two very important cognitive biases. These are two of the biggest ones that are serious problems. And one of them is actually a really big problem for me. It's called the optimism bias. Now, the optimism bias is very characteristic of entrepreneurs, small business owners, because they're optimistic. And that helps them start a business. That helps them motivate them to move forward and go forward and build up their business. Unfortunately, of course, starting a small business is very risky. As I hope you know, about half of all small businesses fail within the first 5 years. 3/4 fail within the first 10 years. And that is not a good rate of success. So you have to be surprisingly optimistic to go forward. Now, when you do a SWOT analysis and you don't account for that internal optimism, which I also experience, you tend to list way too many strengths, way too many opportunities, and not nearly enough threats and risks. So not nearly enough threats and weaknesses. And that's what I tend to see with my clients when they do a SWOT analysis and they show it to me. And then it's like, well, what about these weaknesses? What about these problems? So I was doing a SWOT analysis for one startup company that it's actually angel investors brought me in to do the SWOT analysis to work with the founder when the company passed 10 million in capitalization. And what I found when the founder showed me the SWOT analysis that he did by himself a few months ago is that he didn't put as a weakness being able to delegate effectively. And that's something that a lot of the angel investors who brought me in, they told me that this is an issue. And they told me that they told him that this is an issue. But he did not put it in his own SWOT analysis. So this is a typical example of where he failed to acknowledge that this is a weakness. And so I've seen this happen so many times. And so the optimism...
Because you lack a lot of objectivity.
Exactly.
Especially if you're a solopreneur trying to perform a SWOT analysis. And I think you covered this later in the book when you talked about having objective, unemotionally unattached third-party people who you can trust. And I just wanted to interject that real quick before I didn't mean to interrupt, but go ahead.
No. This is absolutely valid. So if he had one of his angel investors give him feedback, for example, it doesn't have to be an external coach like me. It can be an angel investor, somebody on the board, somebody else who is not in a position subordinate to him. Give him feedback. So on the SWOT analysis, that would have been much more helpful. But yes, so another issue with the SWOT analysis, another cognitive bias that caused him to miss this issue is called the confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. That does not play very well with the optimism bias, where we tend to be very optimistic about ourselves. So we tend to ignore our weaknesses and the threats that we're facing and orient toward our strengths and the opportunities facing us. That's bad. That's a problem, especially, like I said, for startup founders, small business owners who tend to be too optimistic. So the SWOT analysis needs to be done. When you do it, you need to address specifically the weaknesses and the threats much more than seems intuitive to you. And it's especially the case when you do it as part of a group. So when it's not a solopreneur, when it's a team and looks at the SWOT analysis, you tend to fall into what's called groupthink. That's another cognitive bias, where we tend to align around the opinion of the most powerful person in the room, the alpha monkey in the room. That is whose opinion tends to matter the most, and that person tends to be the most optimistic one, of course, because they're the leader. Leaders tend to be much more optimistic than the average bear out there. So unless a leader creates a culture that welcomes dissent and supports it and helps give that constructive criticism up and praises people who can provide constructive criticism, the SWOT analysis does not work well in a team setting either. Whether in a small business where you have the leadership team of a small business do it, or in a large business where you have the leadership team of a large business or a business division within the large business do it. And so I've seen those fail pretty badly as well.
So let me just add something, and this is for you guys that are listening. One of the things that Gleb just pointed out is critically important. I have never, and I'm happy to say, worked in the corporate setting. On the flip side of that, the beautiful and talented Lisa, my wife, has, other than working for me for a short period of time, she's only worked in the corporate setting. And I can tell you that if you want to keep your job in most instances, you simply don't ever want to disagree with your immediate supervisor or the leader of the company. Or having said, so Gleb brings a good point. Now, how I want to apply this to you is that he made a great point. You want to create a culture where you can have constructive dissent, not that people are going to be out bad-mouthing you in public. Obviously, this is all within the confines of the business setting, but you want to create the environment where your employees, your team members, can actually disagree with you in a constructive way, not in a demeaning or combative way, so that if you are overlooking something, if you have developed, which all of us do by nature, confirmation bias. I'm a fisherman, and so when I fish, somebody could be fishing in front of me, or I could be not catching any fish, and still I pull my boat around the corner on the lake, and I'm now at a spot where I haven't fished before, and so there's confirmation bias. Well, everything's great. I'm probably going to catch some fish, so I should stay out here and keep going. Okay, and so this is something that we all suffer with, but I wanted just to bring that point up. Now, Gleb, in the book, you also, one of the favorite movies that I've seen, and I'm not a big movie watcher, nor am I a big TV watcher, actually, especially TV. You talked about the movie Moneyball and how they utilized a lot of the principles and the strategies, I won't say equations per se, but the framework, the tools you've assembled, something similar. And so with Moneyball, let's talk about that for just a second, because in Moneyball, they use data and analytics to create really a super successful team out of a bunch of players that were being viewed as inefficient, past their prime, not worth the money, so on and so forth. But let's talk about how this principle that was utilized in Moneyball can apply to a small business. And certainly, I don't know that we want to dive into all the data and analytics, because that will tend to overwhelm some people. But certainly, there's a process for doing this in the small business setting where you don't have to go to the extremes like they did in the movie, the Oakland A's did in that movie. So,
yeah, absolutely. So the Oakland Athletics, as Ken described, used math, probability statistics to figure out the best players for a combination for their teams, and they won out against much better teams, which had much more expensive players. Small businesses can do the same if they can apply simple math, easy math, to their equations, to their probabilities of the future. For example, I was working with a small business in Pittsburgh, which was doing heavy manufacturing. And what it tended to find was that what its problem was, the specific reason why I was brought in, was that it was losing surprising amounts of money on contracts. It was some of the contracts that it was bidding on, it ended up with a much smaller profit margin, or even lost money compared to what it thought it would have. So let's say it bid on a project that was worth $5 million, and it came in for them costing $6 million or $7 million or something like that. Or bid on a project that was $3 million, and they came in at $2.8 million, which really wasn't worth their time to do that. So much lower profit margins than they actually should have come in for. And so we examined their processes and what happened and what they were doing. And what we found was that they fell into one of the cognitive biases called the planning fallacy. Now, the planning fallacy refers to our tendency to think that good things about ourselves, good things about our plans, and not build in risks and problems and issues into our plans. And so as a result, they just didn't build these things into their plans. And they didn't think about ways that problems, risks, issues can come up. And there are many ways that they can come up. Especially for them, one of the issues that tended to come up was that they tended to allow the client to make too many changes at the last stages of the project. And that was a bad idea, where they had to readjust things, fix things that they really shouldn't have. So that was one of the issues. There were a number of other issues. So what they found once they looked at the math, once they looked at, hey, where are the costs actually coming from? And why are we making these bad estimates? They were able to make much better estimates going forward. A, because they anticipated many more risks and problems that they had in the past, and they built it into future contracts. And B, because they developed a process, a system where they had the clients finalize and sign off on various stages of the contract before they went forward. So not allowing the client to make last-minute changes, as clients too often tend to do. And as a result, when they went forward into the future, when they built on a contract that was going to be $6 million, it cost them $4 million to make, which was much more of the kind of profit margin that they were looking for. And even though their bids were no longer kind of as low as they were in the past, what they started to do was build into the bid saying, hey, here are the kind of problems we've seen in the past with these sorts of projects, and here's how we can address these sorts of problems and make sure that they are addressed in the process. And so their bids had more credibility than people who made low-ball bids, and their bids were pretty often accepted. So they had a slightly less work because the bids weren't the lowest, but they made much more profit going forward. So that's a specific example of how a small business, by instituting a process and examining the specific math in the various components of its project, can really address a lot of problems and have a much higher profit margin.
Obviously the title of your book is Never Go With Your Gut. And I think a lot of people, another way to say that in my mind is fly by the seat of your pants, so to speak. And I think, you mentioned earlier in the interview where you talked about the percentage of small business failures. I would say that the vast majority of those people that are failing, and I'm not talking about people who are failing now due to no fault of their own. I mean, when the government forces you to close your business, what are you going to do? So taking that aside for just a minute, because I want to come back to that in this question, there are a lot of people who, I would say the greater percentage of the ones that end up failing are the people that have gone with their gut, so to speak, in making the decisions to start a business, how they're going to market their business, promote the business, people they hire, things like that. I've just got a good feeling about this person that I'm going to hire, and they turn out to be a disaster. And so this process applies across the board. But as it relates to COVID-19, people now more than ever before, like I said before, I've never experienced anything like this. I'm only 54. I have clients that are, in their 70s. I got a client who's 80 years old, and then a lot of younger people. So this is all new territory for us. And I think it sets a precedent now like never before that we need to be able to make decisions where we can, emotions are a critical component for us as human beings. And so certainly there is an emotional component, even in the framework of making decisions with data within the framework you're suggesting, because human beings can't make decisions if they're not able to, as an example, experience emotion. But your framework is guiding us using a process that will allow us to make decisions much more predictably, much more safely, I think, than just going with this is how I feel or my gut. So that leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, and that is, the term of going with your gut. I think that's kind of a broad brush statement, but what are some of the ways where people, you've mentioned some of the biases that we use, and certainly I'm familiar with all of them, having made millions and millions of dollars in my life, but I've also wasted just hordes of money by making these mistakes that you're talking about. And so, in looking back, what are some of the types of examples you could give of people going with their gut, how they've ended, you can end up screwing things up, and why that's especially relevant and something we really need to be aware of, considering the fact that a lot of us, a lot of business owners are having to make serious decisions like never before at this time.
So I think there's a lot of important issues in what you've raised. And before I go to the gut, I just want to highlight the reasons for business failure. So if you look at studies for why small businesses fail, why startups fail, the top reason for failure is mismatch of product to market. And that's very much of a bad strategic decision. You should never have a mismatch of product to market when you start up a business. You should always do research on your product and your market before you start up a business. So that's a purely strategic decision-making failure, absolutely. Second, they run out of cash. That's another purely strategic decision-making failure. You should be able to math out your products, your price points, and not run out of cash. So absolutely, the top two reasons for small business failure purely have to do with bad decision making by the business leadership. So highlighting that.
And this is pre-COVID-19.
This is pre-COVID. This is all pre-COVID-19.
Yeah. But just stress that he's not saying if you're struggling or if you've, God forbid, lost your business or something. This is due to no fault of your own right now.
Yeah.
I know people who've invested all of their savings. They didn't go to the bank, didn't borrow money, invested all their savings, and now they're tanking and they don't have a business relationship with the bank, so they don't even have a way to go get. And actually, I just heard today they ran out of money, at least in the first leg of this, for the CARE Act. Hopefully they'll have more. But so he's talking pre-COVID-19. So having said that, I don't want anybody to misunderstand and feel like he's unfairly beating them up, because that's not it at all. So now that I've brought that to the surface, Gleb, go ahead and continue with your answer.
So for going with your gut, and thank you for highlighting that, for going with your gut, the reason you don't want to go with your gut, the reason you don't want to trust your intuitions is that they're not adapted for the modern world. That's not what they're adapted for. They're adapted for the savannah. That's what the research on the mind shows us very clearly, very concisely. That's what they're adapted for. When we were hunters and gatherers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, that's what our gut intuitions are adapted for. So think about that. What does that mean for us? Well, our main threat response is the fight or flight response. That's how we feel. That's what our gut intuition, that's how it responds to threats. In the savannah environment, that was perfect because, we faced saber-toothed tigers and we had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. In the modern environment, that's not the kind of response we want to have. We have many fewer saber-toothed tigers. Instead, the kind of threats we face are constructive critical emails from our clients. So let's say constructive critical email from your client. The temptation when you get that is to either have the flight response, which is ignoring the email, deleting it never happened, right? That's one. Or the fight response, depending on your personality. You want to write back and say, no, what are you talking about? I'm right, you're wrong, you're a jerk, I'm awesome. That's the kind of fight response you have. Neither of those is going to help you with your business. What you want to do is you want to realize that if one client is writing the email, then probably 100 people are thinking that. And then you want to look at the underlying systems and processes in your business that led to the problem that caused the client to write the email and address the problems in the underlying systems and processes, tell the client that, calm them down, and address the situation. That's completely counterintuitive. Goes absolutely against your emotions, your intuitions, your gut reactions. That's not what it feels like is the right thing to do. But hopefully you've learned how to do that effectively if you are going forward with your business. So that's in a regular life situation. Let's talk about COVID-19. COVID-19, the intuitive response to that major threat is, again, the fight or flight. There's a whole bunch of people who have the flight response. I've seen that happen from so many business leaders who just completely ignore the situation, thinking it won't touch me, it's not a big deal, nothing like that. And it's not simply small business owners. I mean, look at Hobby Lobby, national chain of arts and crafts stores. It tried to get itself labeled as essential, as saying it's essential and therefore will stay open. Arts and crafts are not essential. Let's just be clear about that. That is not an essential business. You can argue with whether the government should or should not be closing things, but when you want to talk about what's essential or what's not, arts and crafts isn't. So that's an example where they were fleeing from the reality of the situation. You don't want to be in that position, and look at how much bad PR they got across the nation. Of course, it will cost them business later on when they're allowed to open, and right now for online sales. You don't want to be in that. The fight response. A lot of businesses went with the fight response, which is trying to do whatever they can to immediately address the urgent threat. And they did the equivalent of people going to the store and buying toilet paper, except in business terms. And some of them just went to their existing business emergency continuity plans, which is very important to have, but those are not meant for COVID-19. Those are meant for the situation of Houston being flooded. Pretty terrible, but that's a kind of a 1 week break in your business. Not Houston being flooded and then staying flooded, which is what COVID-19 is about. COVID-19 will be around for at least the next 2 years until they create a vaccine, and we'll be facing waves of restrictions and loosenings. That's what's happened in countries that successfully controlled the outbreak. Countries like Germany, countries like Singapore, Japan, not the United States, not the UK. We did not successfully control the initial outbreak. We're still getting there. But what those countries that successfully controlled the outbreak with initial strict guidelines and then loosening, they had secondary outbreaks. So they had more disease pop up and they had to have another set of restrictions. And that's what we'll be facing in various areas of the country, where restrictions will be loosened in the next couple of weeks, couple of months, and then more cases of COVID-19 will pop up, and then there will be more restrictions. So that's what you're dealing with. This is not, again, Houston being flooded for a week. This is Houston being flooded and staying flooded. That's the mindset. This is a slow-moving train wreck. And having the fight or flight response is absolutely the wrong response to it. What you need to do is fundamentally revise and change your business model. But it doesn't feel that way. That's not the way it feels. Our gut reaction can't process it. What we are facing, this cognitive bias here, is called the normalcy bias. The normalcy bias causes us to feel like the future, the immediate future, medium term, next couple of years, will be most of the past. Maybe people will be using cell phones more. That's the kind of things that our gut reaction feels. It does not accept that within a few short weeks, we have underwent a major disruption to our world, which changes it forever. Because in the most optimistic case, vaccines will be developed, created, approved, and mass-produced and then vaccinated by early 2022. That's the super most optimistic case, according to all the top health experts, Tony Fauci and so on. More likely that it will not be super optimistic. When has the government ever done a wonderful job with producing vaccines or whatnot? I don't trust the government to do the most effective and wonderful job in the most optimistic scenario. It will most likely be 2023, 2024, maybe as late as 2025 if we don't get lucky. So in that situation, you want to prepare for the long term, and you want to convince your emotions, your intuitions, that they are wrong. You want to be able to set them aside when they don't lead you in the right direction. Just like it feels very comfortable to go and eat a whole box of donuts. It feels very comfortable. There's a box of dozen donuts and you want to eat it.
That would make me sick. Just the thought of that is just so unappealing. But I know there are some people. I saw a lady, I film my podcast. I do all my work out of a condo and not in my house. And so I saw a lady walking across the parking lot, and this is a very upscale part of town. I live in a town called Wildwood, which is just west of St. Louis, in a very upscale part of town, like the neighborhoods where the houses are. Like we've got 10 acres, and the other houses are all on estates and horses and pools and things like that. And so these are not nothing against trailers, but this is not like a trailer park inner city type neighborhood. And I don't mean to demean people, but sometimes people of low income will utilize drugs or food or whatever. Not that they're bad people. I just don't want to run too far with this, but she had a whole entire box, and she was morbidly obese of Krispy Kreme donuts. Just the thought popped into my mind. I could be wrong. That could have been a box for a family of 12. I don't know, but just the thought popped into my mind. Man, I bet she's going to go gorge on all those donuts. And I felt really bad for her, but yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's not a good decision, but just the thought of eating a box of donuts makes me feel sick.
Well, I'm glad that you've learned it, but it's not an intuitive thing. You have to learn that people, when they open a gallon of ice cream, it's very tempting to eat the whole thing, and there are plenty of people who do. That's just the temptation. You have to learn over time that is not the right thing to do for your health. And that is not an intuitive thing at all, because in the savanna environment, when we found a source of sugar, of honey, of apples, of bananas, it was imperative for us to eat the whole thing. Otherwise, it would be very hard for us to survive.
Okay, so Gleb, let's do this. Certainly, things could be bad. Certainly, things are bad. But I want to try to stay, and not that you weren't being positive. I think you're being overly positive by giving us truthful answers. And sometimes people don't want to hear the truth. They'd rather, because of emotion, again, nobody likes change, but change is inevitable. And I do think we're going to have ebbs and flows of this to deal with for a very long time. But people can adapt. And the people who choose to proactively approach this in a very constructive and thoughtful manner, using, as an example, the framework we're about to cover, and this is all included in the book. So guys, at a minimum, and Gleb, you also mentioned that you have like worksheets and workbooks that as tools. We'll cover those at the end of the show. But guys, I don't want you to think like you actually have to hire Gleb. Certainly, if you want to hire him, I recommend it. But let's say you just want to dip your toes in the water, get your feet wet first to see if this is right for you. First thing you do is invest in his book. Okay. It's, I mean, $10-15 for a book. I mean, come on. That's an investment that is a no-brainer. And certainly it is worth the time to map this out. This is not a book you read once and put down. This is a workbook. This is the way I see that. This is a workbook, a manual for success, really, and making good decisions. So, Gleb, let's do this. You talked about, you've created a couple different frameworks. Let me see my question here, the one I want to ask you. I want to talk about the 8-step decision model. And these are part of the debiasing tools that you've created. Yes. So we're going to touch on each. What I'd like to do is, first of all, give us about a 1 to 2 minute definition of debiasing and why it's important to the business owner. And I hate to constrain you on time, but we are running short. And then I want to go through each one of these decision questions that we need to ask, and then like I said, look at them from a 30,000 foot view, talk about each one of these 1 through 8. And then we'll also get into the 5 questions you've created to help us to avoid decision disasters. But let's first talk about debiasing, and then we'll move into these 8-step decision model that you created, the framework.
Sounds great, Ken. So, debiasing, that's the practice of figuring out what kind of cognitive biases we have and how do you effectively defeat them. There are over 100 cognitive biases. You can take a look at the list of over 100 on Wikipedia. So that's a lot. My book talks about the 30 most dangerous ones for business settings and how do you specifically identify and defeat each one. So debiasing involves learning about these problems, which of course you need to know about a problem in order to address it. Then specific techniques for addressing each one of them individually. So you want to know about which ones are you're most vulnerable to. For example, I'm most vulnerable to the optimism bias, as I mentioned before. So I have 20 ideas before breakfast and I think all of them are brilliant. That's not a good thing. I've learned to my bitter experience they're not. So one of the ways I get help with that is I make sure to hire people into my company, Disaster Avoidance Experts, consulting, coaching, and training company, who are pessimists, who have the pessimism bias, which is the opposite. They think the world is, hostile and bad, and they're too risk averse. And when I give them my 20 ideas, brilliant ideas, they say, hey, these ideas are all half-baked potatoes, but these 3 are worth finishing baking. They're terrible at generating ideas, pessimists are, but they're great at figuring out which ones are worthwhile to go forward, which ones are least bad, fixing the flaws in these, and then implementing them effectively. So getting that outside perspective from pessimists is incredibly useful as a tool for debiasing that specific bias. And there are specific techniques that we're going to go through next that can address a whole bunch of cognitive biases at once, and that's the practice of debiasing.
Okay, and so let's talk about the framework you've set up. You have 8 individual questions that I set up, or not necessarily questions, but things that we have to address. So the first one, I'll read these off, and then you give me like a minute or so on each one. Mm-hmm. Number 1 is to identify the need for a decision to be made.
This is very important. People don't think of decision-making model having a step where you identify the need for decision to be made. But too many people don't identify the need for a decision to be made. For example, here in the mid of COVID-19, a lot of people are still in their emergency plan and they haven't identified the need to fundamentally revise their business model for the next couple of years at least. And that's something they need to do. Now, some people, I'm going to just say this, if you're in the restaurant business, you want to think about getting out of the restaurant business. That's a very important decision for you to make, because you will not be very successful in the next couple of years unless you run something that's super adaptable to delivery. But that's kind of one area. Most businesses can survive and thrive if they identify right now the need for a fundamental revision of their business model. They will be able to thrive in the new environment, especially compared to their competitors who won't.
Yeah, one of the groups that I work with, especially two of the groups actually, as far as professionals, dentists and chiropractors, and as a former chiropractor retired after 17 years, they're going to have to rethink that whole model, especially dentists, because even though they put new appliances on the end of like the vacuum hose to suck out your mouth and to rinse and things, if somebody comes in with COVID, that virus is going to go right down through those lines. And in fact, there are companies that actually they have processes for cleaning those lines, and those lines pre-COVID are filled with bacteria. And so dentistry is an absolutely necessity. We have to have dentistry, or we're going to have people with just increased incidence of heart disease and all kinds of other bad stuff. But just those two professions alone, I think a lot of small business owners like me, people who are working online, we have a lot more flexibility and latitude, but brick and mortar people, especially like you said, restaurants, I don't have any restaurant clients, but I know they're certainly relevant. People who sell insurance, things like that, they can go virtual like we're doing right now, but it's going to be much more difficult. It's going to be really hard for dentists. I'm sure they'll solve this, and chiropractors, because of especially dentists, man. It's just a real bad deal. Okay, so number 2 in your framework is gather relevant information from a variety of informed perspectives on the issue at hand. Talk about that.
So I mentioned already how I make sure to go to a pessimist when I have a brilliant idea. It's very tempting for us to cherry pick information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. Talked about confirmation bias. There are a variety of other related biases that cause us to fail to look at reality accurately. So you want to go and gather relevant information from people who don't necessarily agree with you. A variety of perspectives. Some people who might agree with you, but especially pay attention to those who disagree with you, who have information doesn't feel like it's comfortable for you to get. So look for uncomfortable information and gather all of that as part of your decision-making process, and weigh the uncomfortable information. Information that goes against your gut reactions, that feels like, I just want to reject it and ignore it, flinch away from it. Weigh that information more heavily, twice as heavily at least, as you would positive information toward your decision.
Yeah, that's one of the things you talk about, being uncomfortable and people avoiding that. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I tell people, tell my clients specifically, is if you have a new patient, and this goes along the lines of people who are selling higher ticket items specifically, because if it was just a $20 item somebody was selling online, you don't want to waste the time doing that unless it's just a big problem. But if you've got a $30,000 patient that comes in and you're talking about doing a full mouth, or $50,000 patient, and they decide not to go with it, get on the phone with them after the fact and talk to them about why they didn't move forward. And if you notice commonalities, if you start noticing, you call each person and you notice a common theme or a common reason people are giving you, maybe a majority of the time or all the time, you can fix that. But a lot of people won't do that because it's uncomfortable to face somebody who doesn't agree with you. It's uncomfortable to face what appears to be rejection, even though it's not personal in most instances. So I think this is great advice. Talk to people who have a differing opinion than you, people who are trying to shoot down your idea. It's not personal. You're paying these people, or you're incorporating these people to help you, and they're not being negative for the sake of being negative. They're being pragmatic. They're being realistic in their eyes from their viewpoint, and that's why you want to encourage, Gleb is encouraging to use these people. What about number 3? It says, decide on the goals you want to reach and paint a clear vision of the desired outcome. Talk about that one.
So let's say you're a dentist who's trying to adapt for the future living with COVID-19. How do you figure out what things you should do? Well, you want to think about a clear vision of each element of your business. You don't want to just have a feeling like, I want to make sure that my dentistry works out in this new environment. That feeling of gut reaction that will not really help you make sure that you think through every element of what is going to happen. So have a clear vision of each element of the dentistry business, from the tubes that Ken mentioned to the intake process, how close you will have people sitting to each other, all of these things. Walk through your business as though you're a patient, as well as behind the scenes, making sure that each element is maximally adapted to having a good environment in the pandemic. And then how will you market that? How will you communicate that to your potential clients, to your existing clients, new clients, that you are well set up for this situation? Because many of them will be worried about the situation naturally. I mean, I have a dental appointment that had to be canceled because of the situation. And I'm definitely thinking about, how will my dentist prepare for this new environment that we're living in? So you want to also communicate that to your clients effectively.
Yeah, preemptively discuss that with them and reassure them. That's one of the things I talked about my last episode is, preparing to come out of this is going to have everything to do with trust. Mm-hmm. Trust is a big issue. People aren't spending money, so it's not just trust about, hey, our business is prepared to keep you safe so that we're not spreading this disease to you, this process to you. But at the same time, because of the fact people are spending a lot less money, they're still spending money, but they're just a lot more careful about it. There are fewer people spending money, so you've got to have a high element of trust, and that's where STORYMONIALS come in, and those are story-based testimonials, and we can talk about that at a later date. But having social proof and ways to create trust, Gleb makes a great point. What about number 4? Develop clear decision-making criteria to evaluate options.
So you want to think about what are going to be the criteria for you to successfully thrive in the pandemic. One, of course, is going to be how much all of these changes are going to cost you. So the costs of all of these changes. One is how much safety you'll be able to increase and how can you address safety issues. A third one might be what Ken mentioned about trust. So how you can effectively cultivate trust for all of these changes. So these 3 might be criteria, and there might be many others depending on what you're thinking about, how you're thinking through. But those can be 3 criteria that you maximize. And then think about how important each one is going to be. So let's say that you have a good cash balance, you've applied for government stimulus programs, you may not be worried about cost as much as you're worried about safety and trust. So maybe you put costs on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is low, 10 is high for how important each one is. You put costs at, let's say, a 5, and you really want to prioritize safety. You have that as a really important consideration. So you say that that's going to be a 9. And let's say trust, you say it's going to be somewhere between those two. So you put it at a 7. That way you weigh the various criteria. You could do that for all the other criteria that you go through. So you want to weigh the various criteria so that you understand what is most important to you in this decision-making process.
Sweet. What about number 5? It says generate viable options that can achieve your goals.
It's very often that business owners, especially small business owners, they just want to solve a problem and they want to go forward, and then solve the next problem, they want to go forward. So they settle for the first available option. That's a bad idea when you want to make a major decision, because a major decision is going to really impact you thoroughly going forward. So if you're thinking about how to change your waiting room, it's very tempting to think about the first safe configuration that you have for COVID-19 and then go forward. But if you take some more time and think about various other configurations, you can still come up with safe configurations, but ones that can allow more patients to be in the waiting room at once, or ones that can increase safety and all of these other concerns. So by taking a little bit more time on each question, on each way of addressing each problem, you will help yourself much more going forward. Considering it's going to be at least 2 years before we have vaccine available, you really want to make sure that you are well set up for the future and that you don't need to change your waiting room for this time. The same applies to your equipment. Whatever equipment changes you want to make, try to generate viable options for each one, sufficient viable options. What I recommend my clients do is that they generate at least 5 viable options for each choice. And then then the next one, I'll skip that before Ken goes into it. You want to weigh the options, picking the best of the bunch, that's the number 6, based on the criteria that we talked about earlier. So whatever criteria you chose, you weigh them on each of the ranked criteria, and then you choose the best ones.
So I'm going to just reference just quickly, and this just popped up in my head. I've studied a lot with Bob Cialdini, and I'm sure you know who Dr. Bob Cialdini is. He wrote Influence and several, Persuasion. He talks about not giving people more than a handful of choices, like 3, at the most 5. Can a person get by with just creating 3 viable options in this particular instance? Is that a safe place to work from, for each instance, or does it have to be 5?
From what the research on this topic suggests, when you're making a major choice, it's best to go with 5. Now, this is when you're making a serious choice, a major choice. Or what Bob Cialdini is talking about is when you're not making a very big choice. And Bob is great, and he talks about important things, but you want to differentiate between making very big choices, like how do you adapt your business to the next 2 years at least of the COVID-19 pandemic, versus which minor thing you'll get that costs $100. You don't want to spend too much time thinking about those sorts of things.
So my question, I didn't answer, right? You answered part of it correctly, but so for decisions that aren't like make or break decisions that are important, but we got to make a lot of them and we're constrained by time. The time constraint with this added pressure of all the things that are going on right now, could we get by for those moderate, low to moderate level decisions?
3 is fine for those moderate.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, cool beans. Thanks for clearing that up. Okay, and then number 7, implement the option you chose. And then 8, you can just nail both of these together. Evaluate the implementation process. Obviously, that's test, review, and test. Yes?
So for 7, what you want to do is to implement it effectively. You want to do 2 things. Part 1, you want to avoid failure, and part 2, you want to maximize success. You avoid failure by imagining that all of your adaptations, whatever you adapted to COVID-19, that they failed. Each one of them failed. So imagine they failed, utterly failed, and then think about why they failed. Think about all the reasons for failure for each one. And then address these reasons. Address these reasons in advance before they fail. So that will really help you address failure in advance. The second part of it is kind of the same except for success. Imagine each one of them succeeded wonderfully. They succeeded 100%. Think about why they succeeded and put things into place to maximize this success. So that's 2 parts. Avoid failure, maximize success. And then 8, so of course, test and review. What you want to do is you want to make sure to create metrics. So for example, we talked about your waiting room in the dentist's office. Before patients start going into it, create metrics for success. What does it mean for your waiting room configuration to be actually successful? Do patients find it comfortable to use? Do they spend appropriate amount of time with it? Do they actually do the social distancing that they should? All of these things. Think about that. Same thing for your equipment, whatever changes you make. And then evaluate over time to make sure that you are actually hitting those metrics, those benchmarks that you set for yourself. And of course, revise things as needed. Your initial configuration or your equipment setup might not be the best and you might not hit your metrics. And it's fine. You just go and evaluate and revise it as needed.
Gleb, this is, especially number 7, when you talked about, thinking about this. I'm going to make just 2 quick points. Number 1, thinking is one of the most difficult things. And I'm not referring to intellect and our intelligence at this point, but just thinking on any level, a constructive level. This is why so many people get lost in TV, because they don't want to think. They want to be lazy and just not have to think. And so thinking about all of these steps utterly failing and why they would fail, this really has to do a lot with theater of the mind. Dr. Maxwell Maltz talked about this. This is really, really, really good stuff. Thinking about this, you can actually use your brain to think, create scenarios in your mind, and then the theater of your mind, see these things working out, the processes. This is just excellent information. Number 7, looking at this from a failure standpoint, this has broad application across the board. I've never, ever, I'll just be honest, I've never thought of that before. I've never utilized the process of, hey, all my ideas are going to fail miserably. Why did they fail? Before I started something, all of my ideas are going to work great. Okay, why did they work great? And how can I maximize that? I've never used that particular framework. So that in and of itself, at least for me personally in my business, was just like, that was like a $20,000 or $50,000, $100,000 piece of advice you just gave me right there. That was great. Let's do this, Gleb, if we could. Let's talk about the 5 questions you've created that are going to help us avoid decision disasters. And I don't want to just say necessarily questions, because they are questions, but there's a lot more to that. But let's run through these just kind of like we did with number 9, and then want to get to questions about you and your business and how people can, number 1, get your book. And then I'm really interested in the workbooks you mentioned, the tools, worksheets, things like that you have, and then the consulting obviously as well. But here's the first question. What important information didn't I yet fully consider?
Let me clarify. The 8-step process is for major big decisions, major changes that you want to make. These 5 questions are for more moderate decisions, for those everyday decisions that you have to make, but they're not going to be make or break. So the 8-step decision-making process, much longer, more thorough, an hour plus time. This is a couple of minutes for those moderate decisions that you don't want to screw up. So what important information didn't I yet fully consider? This again has to do with the confirmation bias. So you want to try to prove yourself wrong. You want to look at information that you didn't consider and see how you can prove yourself wrong. Try to just confirm your initial decision. If you can't, that's great. It's more likely to be right. And if you can, that's also great because then you're not going to be wrong.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so the next one is, what relevant, dangerous judgment errors didn't I address yet? These are just really powerful things you've put together. I'm really, truly, genuinely very impressed by this. So go ahead and reflect on that one if you could.
Thank you so much, Ken. So this one is about the cognitive biases. My book talks about the 30 most dangerous ones, and you want to know about them because specific ones to apply to specific situations. If you're dealing with people, there's going to be cognitive biases about tribalism. So we lived in small tribes, and it's very tempting for us to look for people who look like us, who think like us, who feel like we do, who share our values. Those are not necessarily the best people to have in our business, especially for me, for example. I like to work with other optimists. It feels good to me. I click with them. We have shared ideas. But I know that if I have 5 people in my business who are optimists, we'll all have 20 ideas before breakfast, and we'll reinforce each other's ideas, and we'll be implementing 100 different projects, and that's how small businesses fail. That is not something you want to have. So know about the kind of cognitive biases that are relevant for each question, and then make sure to address them in the decision-making process.
Yeah, one of the worst hires I ever made was to hire an office manager, and I hired her based on, she wasn't misleading to me at all. She was very honest, but her idea of, she had worked as an office manager in one particular setting in a different kind of business. When I brought her in to manage one of my clinics, it was a disaster. And I only hired her because I'm a Christian, and she went to church with me, and I felt like she was, super honest, just a really good person. She had 20 years of experiencing managing this other office, but it was real slow paced. And, we're seeing over 100 patients a day in this one particular office, and it just overwhelmed her and was too much. And my decision to hire her because of, the primary reason was I thought she was qualified, but obviously I want to hire her. I go to church with her, and I know she's an honest person. And, to talk about tribalism, I hired her because she was a Christian person, and I thought she was qualified, but it was a disaster. And it was even more so a disaster when I had to eventually let her go. It was just very, very difficult. But anyway, what about the next one? It says, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest that I do?
So we talked already about my example of having a pessimist who I run my ideas by. You want to have someone who's a trusted and objective advisor to run your ideas by, whether it's going to be a member of your board, a member of your family, a peer, if you have another dentist who can help give you feedback, if you have a coach, someone like that who you can run your ideas by. Now, you get about 50% of the benefit of this question just by asking it, even without consulting another person, just by imagining this person. Think about what you would tell a trusted friend in this situation. And of course, you get the other 50% of the benefit by actually calling this person, or if you're a millennial, texting this person.
And so one thing I think is important, this person needs to have a working understanding of your business, your niche, your industry, not just someone who's going to counter your idea. You want to have somebody who's qualified in that regard, that they know your business model, they understand it at least well enough to be able to give you some good information. Yes? Okay. Next one, it says, how have I addressed the ways it could fail?
And this is quite similar to number 7, but it doesn't focus on success because this is these 5 questions are meant to minimize failure, to not screw up. So just imagine that this decision failed and think about how you can address these failures in advance and how you can then put that into your plan. So again, if you're buying something that's not going to make a make or break thing, let's say a $500 tool, think about all the ways that it can be a problem for you and address these in advance. It will take you a couple of minutes to think through these things, and it might save you $500 or more going forward.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out, people might be looking at all these different types of processes to go through and say, wow, if I have to do that with every decision that I make, that's going to take a lot of time. But let me add this. I would think if you've done this a couple times, it becomes intuitive, at least on the moderate decisions. And certainly you want to invest the time on really big decisions because, like you said, they're make or break. So it's foolish not to invest the time, but just run-of-the-mill decisions. This becomes intuitive. You do this, a handful of times or whatever. It's just like riding a bike. You don't have to sit down and really plot through this. You can come up with relatively accurate, good decisions that are not from the gut, that are based on the framework, utilizing the framework that you've put together to help you make the best decisions possible. Yes?
You're absolutely right. And there's a framework of decision-making that was adapted to UK firefighters in the UK. So there was a study that evaluated firefighting in the UK and found that about 80% of mistakes in firefighters came from human error. And they developed a series of questions much like these for firefighting leaders to ask themselves before they sent their team into fighting the heat. So this was very much, the heat of the moment sort of questions. And they found that after firefighters got used to asking them in a couple of months, the people who started asking these questions made many fewer errors than people who didn't ask these questions, and they didn't take any more time to make the decision. They took the same amount of time but made many less mistakes. So this was a great intervention for people who are literally making the decision in the heat of the moment. I can guarantee to you that you have more time than firefighters who are fighting a fire to make your decisions.
Absolutely. Okay, and so did we cover the last one? What new information? Okay, let's cover that one. Last question is, what new information would cause me to revisit the decision?
This is something really important for you to have as a tool. When you're making the decision, you're in a calm, reflective state. When you've made the decision, you're in an emotional state because you've attached yourself to your decision. When you already purchased the piece of equipment, machinery, you would have to be wrong to change your mind about it. Unless you decide in advance that, hey, here are the metrics that would indicate this is a bad purchase, and therefore this is what I would do if this is indeed a bad purchase. So you have to help yourself make sure that you're not wrong, that you're not too emotionally attached to the decision, and that you don't have to go against your ego in order to change your mind.
Yeah, I think it's Bob Cialdini who gives who notes the study with respect to confirmation bias, where people bought a lottery ticket for, say, $5, and then they were offered $10 for that lottery ticket before they scratched it off, and they wouldn't take the $10 because once they made that decision, they owned that decision, and right. So this goes straight in line with that, and that's the nature of human beings. So to build this in prior to the decision is this is genius, man. This is really good stuff. I really appreciate the work you've done. Here's my question for you. I'm going to ask one more question before I ask you about how we can find out more about you and those type of questions. But what's the one question today, Gleb, that I should have asked you that I didn't?
I would say it's about how to specifically address the emotions that we feel and what is the role of emotions in decision making. So we talked about that on and off, but I think something that's really important for us to understand is that emotions are fundamentally important. They determine about 80 to 90% of our behaviors, of our thought patterns. When we just go forward, let them do so. So what you want to do with emotions is recognize them, be very much in touch with them, understand how you feel, and use them to determine your long-term goals. So that's the right place for emotions. Your goals, your values, what you want to see accomplished. That's perfect. That's what your emotions should be there for. They should not be how you make the decisions. That's about your brain. You want to use your head for making the decisions and making a plan for going forward. That's not an emotional place. You want to use your emotions to determine your outcomes and your objectives, not the tactics and the strategies of how to get there.
Okay. And so here's what I'd like you to do. Number one, tell me the full title of your book, because I only, Never Go With Your Gut is not the full title. But tell me the full title of your book, and then tell me, in addition to Amazon, where else we can buy the book. That's my first question.
Of course. So never go with your gut. How pioneering leaders make the best decisions and avoid business disasters is the full title. And it's available on Amazon. It's actually published by a great traditional publisher called Career Press. So it's available in bookstores everywhere if they're still open around you. And if not, of course, you can get them on Barnes & Noble. You can get the book on my website. So disasteravoidanceexperts.com. And there's the physical copy. Of course, there's a digital copy. There's an audiobook copy. So if you like audiobooks, you can go to audible.com and get the book there.
Okay. And then with respect, Gleb, to you talked about tools and worksheets and things like that, and even consulting. If we go to your website, tell us your URL again, a little slower. You talk fast like I do. Tell us where to go to find out more information about that, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest with respect to, at a minimum, the book. And guys, I'll say this: if you buy his book, I've actually done a lot of these lately, just because the people, their work has been so good. But buy his book, use it, implement it, and if you can't, you're going to say that this was worth multiples of the money you spent and the time you invested in his book. And it's going to work out wonderfully for you. And if you can't say that, email me at customerservice@kennewhouse.com and I'll buy the book from you. But my thoughts are, if you actually do the work and read his book, that's not going to be the case. So I don't have any problems guaranteeing his book. Gleb, I'm actually glad to do so. It's just really good, and I'm really impressed with the interview today. Certainly, I wish we had more time. This is a very deep subject, one that I think a lot of people, unfortunately, have overlooked. But having said that, if they want to find out more about your tools, your workbooks, and even consulting, give us the URL. And is there a particular page on your website, or can they find that on the homepage on the site?
They can find on the homepage. So disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. And there's going to be the homepage. From there, you can go to the section on consulting coaching. There's a store. So the store section will have manuals, decision aids, guides, classes, virtual coaching, virtual consulting. If you want to check out a free 8 video-based module course on making the wisest decisions, go to disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. Again, it's a free 8 video-based module course on making the wisest decisions. disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe.
And then we'll go from there. But I appreciate your time today. I certainly do. And you're very well spoken and very, very articulate. And I appreciate the way you put everything together.
Thank you so much, Ken. I appreciate that.
All right, bro. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Ken. I really appreciate that. You have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Our objective with this podcast is to help you and your business stand out in the marketplace by crystallizing your messaging, marketing, and communications. On behalf of the whole Ken Newhouse team, thanks for listening.